We're going to dig back into our study series. As most of you are aware, we're in a study series on mental health. And as I was sharing with one of our guests today, that our heart, again, is to continue to grow as a community, to be a place where people don't have to wear masks, or they want to help somebody or just join them in compassion in the struggles in their lives, but don't quite understand what's going on. These are a lot of things that we are covering and digging into to be able to continue to grow in those areas. Today's video, we've been using a video series as part of this because it's been really giving us a great opportunity to see into the lives of some. Is a shorter one. You know, some have been like 15 minutes, some have been half an hour. This is a shorter one, it's a 15-minute one, but that does not mean that this is a smaller topic. Today we're going to be talking about bipolar and living with being bipolar. We've talked about anxiety, we've talked about addiction. Last week we talked about suicidal tendencies. We still got others to dig into as far as eating disorders and PTSD and depression. But really want to just kind of stop and rest and work on things when it comes to this area of bipolar, because it does impact a lot of folks. When we talked about anxiety, talked about it taking and being a challenge for about 20% of those within our country. This is not that same level. This is about 1% to 3%. But it still affects over 2 million people, including people that are in our church, in our community, and in our lives. So I want to make sure that we dive into this and look at it together. So I'm going to start out with a video like we usually do, and then we'll build off of that. So if I could, Miss Sarah.
There was a buildup that eventually brought about an event that me nor my family or friends would have ever thought or imagined would happen to me. In my head, I was believing that at 62 years old, my time was done. I even rationalized that the absence of the body is the presence with the Lord. I had a nice life insurance policy that would protect my family. So when you look at being a protector and provider, I was covering all those. I was doing the check marks. And I was going to do the silent death, carbon monoxide poisoning. I drank a bottle of wine, and I went to a place, parked my truck. I had Christian music on the whole time. I had failed to turn my phone off. My daughter called, my brown-eyed girl, pleading with me. And I kept saying, "Jesse, it's best." They were able to get the police department to triangulate my phone. And God sent an angel in a police uniform. He put me in the back of his cruiser and all the way to the hospital. He shared with me about his family, and I shared with him about mine. So at the hospital, they put you on a watch. After I was interviewed by the psychologist there, she said, "Did you really want to die?" And I said, "No, I wanted to live." And I volunteered to go to the ward. So the second day, I'm chatting with my psychiatrist. In his mind, I was just severely depressed. And I actually asked him to chat with my wife, who is a professional counselor. She said, "Doctor, you haven't seen his manic side." He changed his diagnosis to bipolar 2. I have confirmed since that time, almost 3 years ago, through a 98-year-old aunt, that what is now called bipolar, that was called manic depressive, has run in my family for years.
Mental illness is so common. Lots of people are walking around with it. Lots of people love someone who's walking around with it. And basically, we all interact with people who have mental illness on a daily basis. So we can't afford to ignore it or to pretend like it just affects a small number of people.
So bipolar disorder is a mood disorder that is characterized by both periods of depression and then periods of an elevated, expansive, or irritable mood, such as hypomania or mania. Not just depends on genetics, but it depends on the environment and what stressors can play a part into the manifestation of the illness.
I had no idea until I was diagnosed how dangerous manic really is. For when you're manic, your state of mind has been hijacked.
The scary thing about mania is that the person who has it's like the last one to get the memo. So I didn't really understand what it was doing to my marriage.
I was done. I mean, I was done in the sense that I was just exhausted, mentally, physically, emotionally. There was a lot of things that had happened for Jim and I in our relationship, a lot of wounds, a lot of things that had been said that were hurtful.
That mania started out as just the hypomania in the very beginning that was so subtle, not even I could notice it. But over a 6-month period of time, I went from about 205 pounds down to 165. Very productive at work, had all these ideas that were swimming around in my head. I became so manic that I was spending lots of money and became very verbally abusive with Beth.
In the year prior to 2007, his diagnosis, he was misdiagnosed. Definitely diagnosed with depression, but he was put on some medication that was the wrong medication. And so for a year, it escalated him from not being depressed to being more manic. I think for me, a lot of times if he was not depressed, it was a great thing. I was so happy that it wasn't, that I don't think I saw the other upswing of it that he'd probably been going through for several years.
Beth went to my psychiatrist and said, something's not right here. And she started explaining what my behavior had been like over the previous months. And she said that he literally turned white as a ghost. And he looked at her and he said, I don't think Jim has depression. I think he has bipolar disorder. I remember immediately going to my computer and Googling bipolar disorder. And as I started reading the symptoms for the first time, I said, wow, I feel like this really explains me.
What goes up must come down. And the thing is, nobody can predict when you're going to leave manic and head for depression.
When I'm in that dark place, when I'm not well, the irrational thoughts take over and they consume me. It plays into my insecurities that I'm a bad person, that I'm a bad mom, that I'm a bad wife and friend. It's really hard to go through years of trying to find a diagnosis and find doctors that you are comfortable with. So I was diagnosed with depression, but I kept having these episodes. A friend was seeing a doctor and things seemed stable in her world. So I said, why not? Let's try. And that doctor did 3 hours of cognitive and behavioral therapy. And he came in and he said, I think you've been misdiagnosed. And I looked at him and he said, I think you have bipolar type 2. And all I could think of was, I had seen bipolar, the mania, in an extended family member. It was incredibly destructive. It ruined relationships around that person. So that's what I have? And he said, no, you have less pronounced criteria of mania, but you're like a ticking time bomb. And if you don't get help and treat it the right way, it's going to go off. My husband was referring to the illness as sort of like a radio station where you are fine-tuning the dials, and stress might come in and it might mess with that a little bit. So you twist it and you turn it, but ever so slightly, because I've realized that frequency that's healthy.
The nature of mental illness and society's relationship with mental illness causes a separation. 26.2% of the American population, 18 and over, will have a diagnosable mental disorder in any given year. Mental illness is far from a fringe experience. It's very, very common.
You surely would have seen me as a teenager and saw that like I had problems, but those were all just kind of chalked up to, trauma and abuse. I got into some really bad crowds. By the time I was 11, 12, I was smoking cigarettes, became sexually active, was doing drugs. I found myself teenage mother, 16, 17. When I was in high school, we used to actually use bipolar as like a way to tease each other. Like when somebody had a mood swing, like, oh yeah, my girlfriend, she's being bipolar today. It was just a synonym for crazy to me. Like, I didn't really know what it meant or what it looked like on people. It wasn't until years into my counseling journey that I began to see some signs of mental health. I found myself in the hands of a really good psychiatrist. And it was the first time that I was diagnosed with bipolar 2. And it was scary. There was a lot of barriers. For one, when my husband and I began to seek counseling, we couldn't go to the inner city. We didn't find places in our neighborhood.
The mental health system can sometimes be sicker than the patients that we treat. And that is because it's so fragmented, it's so hard to know how to access help. How can we expect the people we treat to be whole if the system isn't? But that's why it takes collaboration, and it takes all of us working together for different populations, different people, different socioeconomic statuses, so that people can get the help that they need and so that we can unify.
But people tend to be so afraid of mental illness because they can't see it and they can't explain it and they don't understand it, that they tend to want to push away from it. They don't want to be around it. They want to go in the opposite direction.
What someone looks like when they're very ill and what they look like when they're stable is night and day. And you wouldn't even think they were the same people. And so it really shows just how successful folks can be with the proper treatment.
It's different for every person of what they need as their regime to be compliant and stable.
Medications, I sort of say it's about 50% of a wellness plan. For me, it was exercise. To make sure that it happens, I scheduled it into my day. And then sleep. The great thing about tracking my sleep is if I see that I haven't gotten enough rest for 3 or 4 nights, I know if I don't kind of get the train back on the tracks, I know where I'm headed. I'm headed into a depressive episode more than likely.
I know that my platform, until the Lord takes me home, is to break the stigma, especially first with men who don't want to share their story.
There's something beautiful and something empowering about that, to know that you're not the only one. And that's why we need community. We can change communities just by letting other people know, hey, me too.
People who have mental health problems are already in every church. So you can create a church where it's not safe to have that problem. Or you can create a church where it is safe to have that problem. And we can bring some hope to that situation and we can move forward, and we can maybe even bring some healing to some of the people who are experiencing these challenges within the church.
There is research that shows that African Americans and minorities are coming to counseling, and that they are more willing to come to counseling than they've ever been before. So I believe that mental illness is being destigmatized, that the stigma is getting better.
The more that we can normalize these conditions, the more people will feel open to getting help, and the more lives we can support, and the more suicide attempts, the suicide completions we can avoid.
I mean, it is a journey. There's so many things in life that are difficult. I think this is one, but I think a lot of the great things in life, and especially in our faith, I don't think they are easy.
A mental illness diagnosis is not all of who you are. It might feel like that in the beginning, but it's really not. I'm an artist, I'm a writer, and I also have bipolar disorder, and that's okay.
I am not bipolar. That would be no different than someone with diabetes saying, I am diabetes. Well, that's not the case. The person with diabetes has a condition called diabetes. I have a chronic illness called bipolar. That is not going to define who I am.
I still struggle. I struggle with my bipolar diagnosis. I struggle with sometimes not wanting to take my meds, wondering, am I really crazy? I still struggle with depression at times. I still struggle with being manic sometimes. And that's okay.
Praise be to God for intervention of an angel in a police uniform, of a floor, a ward for 4 days. Our darkness, whatever that darkness is, through testimony can be someone else's ray of hope. And every time we tell our story, it brings healing to our soul.
As part of our series, we've not just been watching the videos with stories from a national standpoint, but also listening to the voices of some of those within our own church and our own community that have the same struggles. And so I do have some voice that those within our church wanted to share with you. Again, the hope is that we understand that this is something that impacts us within this church and those around us, and not just things from a distance. The first that I'm going to be reading from is from a young lady who was raised in a household impacted by bipolar. At that point, it was called manic depression. And she shared this when dealing with her father. She said, I love my dad dearly, but there was a part of me that resented him. He wasn't diagnosed until later in his adulthood. I don't think that even my mom understood what was going on before then. As a child, I remember Dad coming home from work crying and angry. I hadn't even seen him cry before. I remember the lump in my throat and the tears ready to spill. I didn't understand what it was all about, but I remember the sadness staying with him and in turn with me. We had a family with children come from out of state, and when they started to leave, my dad started gathering up some household items with some of our favorite toys included and gave them to the family's kids. I remember standing there watching the scene play out, motionless, emotions bottled neck so tight I felt numb as I kept a straight face. I remember Mom and Dad arguing later. Their anger was frightening. The view through his eyes of my childhood only had 3 scenes consisting of 50% times of extreme sadness, 20% normalcy, and 30% unorganized chaos. I would see my dad walk up to a stranger and laugh and talk, but return back to his family with his face transformed back into the man we lived with in his depressive state. Fast forward to adulthood, I realized how much of a buffer Mom tried to be for me and my sisters. Then Mom was diagnosed with cancer, and he was left alone. Shortly afterwards, Dad had 2 strokes. During that time, he had made me his power of attorney. It was a constant struggle of working to make sense of his finances when he went from a high to a low. During highs, he would spend all of his money, charge things, and make promises to people. I had to do a voluntary repossession of a vehicle he bought for a caregiver. During his lows, I would set things back on track for him, only to have it happen all over again, time after time. If I tried to talk to him about it, he would get angry. I remember him in my car pounding his fist on the dash as he was yelling at me. I hated it, but I had to treat him like a child, pulling over to the side of the road and refusing to drive again until he settled down. I don't know all the avenues that I'm sure Mom helped him to pursue to get help. I know that he saw a psychiatrist at times, and I know he was supposed to take medication. I know at times he was suicidal. I believe his mental illness played a heavy hand in his inability to see himself as accepted and loved by God. I had to learn to set boundaries with him, and it was hard. I never told my dad no about anything until I was in my 30s, and it felt so wrong. But I love my dad so much, and I still do. I was the little girl who sat on his lap every day when he came home from work. I still cherish and hold on to that 20% that felt almost normal. Some thoughts from someone who within our church that struggles with bipolar as part of their life. The hardest part is probably the extreme mood swings. You can be on cloud nine 1 minute and literally a minute later be ugly crying about something really dumb or totally ticked off at nothing, wishing the world or people or whatever would just blow up. Sometimes something minuscule will set you off and nobody understands what in the world is wrong with you. When asked, what do you wish that people who are not living with bipolar understood? She shared medicine is great and for helping out to balance things, but it's not a cure-all. There are still mood swings, and finding the right dosages of the right meds takes months and even up to a year, and then they only work for a couple to a few years before your body changes and you have to start all over again. It tends to bring on low points where you wish that it would go away and you just be able to see how you can keep going. And sometimes you don't even want to keep going because of the hoops for the rest of your life. Big question then is why? Why is this an issue? What's wrong with me? Why do I have to fight so dang gone hard? I just don't want to deal with it anymore. Then there's watching your kids deal with it because it's genetic. Why do they have to have it? Why couldn't I known about this beforehand? Maybe I wouldn't have opted to have children. Then they wouldn't be suffering too. Why can't I help them? Why can't I help myself? It is so freaking hard, and it breaks your heart over and over and over again. And it will never stop as long as I live. It is a lifetime sentence to serve when I never did anything to earn it. And that is probably one of the hardest parts to try and make sense of. What's wrong with me? Why do I have to deal with this? Why do my kids have to fight with this too? There just isn't any answers or reasons, and it sucks. So obviously we're talking about some big issues that we want to dig into and be able to be there for others that are very real to them, that they can't just get over or act like everybody else. So let's dig into some of the things as far as what is bipolar, how can we help each other, and what encouragement we can give to those who are with them as well. And you know, in the last couple of weeks, I've had Monica up here a couple of weeks to help me out. And when we talked about addiction, Strine came up and helped me. And she works with Mary Haven and Monica with her experience as a life coach and counseling education. And I want to say I appreciate them. And I know a lot of you guys have shared with me a lot of comments about what they have shared and how it's helped and just how impressed you have been with them and how awesome they are. And since I'm completely insecure, they will not be back up here. I'm kidding. Just this week, you just stuck with me. So let's talk about a few things. And but you know it's true. But let's talk about a few things and make sure that we get educated. So if you're a note taker, this is a good time to get ready, as we're going to talk about some things, and it's going to have to expand a little bit, because when it comes to bipolar, personally, while, again, it affects less people, I think this is one of the toughest ones to deal with. I think, as we talked about, all of these have a great spectrum of where people can fall from something that's somewhat challenging to something that makes it almost impossible to get through the day. I believe bipolar is definitely within that range, and when you have an extreme level of bipolar, it really doesn't just challenge that person, but challenges their family, challenges their kids, their marriages, their friendships, and I have seen devastating, I mean downright devastating situations. I have friends that are bipolar, that they take some medicine and they live a pretty normal life, and others that it's just heartbreaking. So it really is kind of hard to cover overall. But again, our goal here is not to walk out of here psychiatrists, but to walk out of here with a heart and a little bit of understanding. As you saw within the videos, there's bipolar 1, there's bipolar 2. I just wanted to explain that a little bit better. Bipolar 1 is defined by the manic episodes that they were talking about that last at least 7 days, or by manic symptoms that are so severe that the person needs immediate hospital care. Usually, depressive episodes occur as well, typically lasting at least 2 weeks. Bipolar 2, on the other hand, is a disorder that involves a major depressive episode lasting at least 2 weeks, and at least one hypomanic episode, a period that's less severe than a full-blown manic episode. People with bipolar 2 typically don't experience manic episodes intense enough to require hospitalization. When you saw the gentleman was talking about just going on Google and looking at some of the symptoms of being bipolar, I wanted to go through some of the symptoms. We haven't done that with some of the others because I think they're a little bit expressive. And I'm going to do it on the screen. And also, there's a lot. So if you don't want to take a bunch of notes, again, just touch base with me email-wise, and I'll send you these screenshots so that you have them as well. But it's important because bipolar is probably the one that's most often misdiagnosed and the one that's most misunderstood for us to be able to see some things. Now, if you see some things within these characteristics that you experience, sure, there's a chance that it might be bipolar, but there's a real good chance it's not, too. This is a chaotic experience, mindset that you cannot escape, that many of these things are swirling around so fast they're like a tornado. So usually if you're seeing something within yourself that might be bipolar, first off, don't assume you're bipolar and start self-medicating yourself. Make sure that you're working with professionals and make sure that you might have to get 2 or 3 opinions within it as well to be able to find it. My mom dealt with anxiety and depression her whole life. I remember a season when she was misdiagnosed as bipolar, and it didn't help. It didn't help. So make sure you don't jump too fast, but I do want to put some of these things. So with the help of Sarah, we'll go through some of these, just list them through up on the screen. First one has to do with mood. Again, you heard many things there about mood swings, sadness, an elevated mood, anger, anxiety, apathy, apprehension, euphoria, general discontent, guilt, hopelessness, loss of interest, loss of interest or pleasure in activities. Next one is behavioral, irritability, risk-taking behaviors, disorganized behavior, aggression, agitation, crying, excess desire for sex, hyperactivity, impulse, you guys forgot how to say that one, restlessness or self-harm. And you will see the one that has to do with sex and shopping come up often. There's a lot when it comes to whether that be just a desire for sex or shopping or to use sex or shopping, and how they spend their money to control others or to get a certain effect. Cognitive, unwanted thoughts, delusion, lack of concentration, racing thoughts, slowness in activity, and or false belief of superiority. Yeah, I'm not saying anything right today. And just to let you know, your pastor's off today. I'm dealing with the situation this weekend. You guys never expect me to be perfect all the time. Thank you. But this weekend's been a little bit of a tough weekend, so I'm having problems keeping some of my thoughts to the point that I can read. You guys know I always mess up with reading when I got too much going on in my head. And that false belief of being superior to others a lot of times will also impact how they deal with people that have leadership roles within their life and how they undercut people with leadership roles within their life. From a psychological, depression, manic episode, agitated depression or paranoia, weight gain or weight loss, sleep, difficulty falling asleep or excess sleepiness. So again, we're talking about extremes on both sides. And then also common fatigue or rapid and frenzied speaking are some of the things that are within this. But again, whenever I have seen it off medication and off of a wellness plan, it's pretty evident to those who are closest to you, a lot sooner than it is to you. And so having trusted friends in our life matters in so many different ways, including listening to other people share concerns with you and not just brushing them off very quickly. For those who are struggling with bipolar or may consider that they're struggling with some of these things, A lot of the stuff that we've talked about over the last 3 weeks fall into this. You're starting to notice by now that we're halfway through this particular series that a lot of these things repeat when it comes to mental illness. So definitely looking at your notes from the past, but just to kind of do something that's a little bit more general overlays. If you are bipolar and you're diagnosed with bipolar, if you don't feel that they're right, then get a second opinion, get a third opinion. But if it's what your diagnosis is, embrace it. Again, it's no worse than to someone realizing they're diabetic. It is just a condition that you carry. It's not who you are. It doesn't define you. It is a challenge that you deal with. So embracing it and leaning into it when it comes to getting some help from a doctor, getting counseling, taking and working a wellness plan, just like these other areas, is critical, because your body, at least within that area of mental health, is set up to throw you far to the left, far to the right, back to the left again. So having things in place, like we talked about last week when we talked about suicidal tendencies, having a plan when you're in a good place and having others involved in that plan and having support from others matters, whether or not you're the one dealing with the bipolar, or if your spouse is dealing with bipolar, or someone close to you is dealing with bipolar. Being able to think it out in a reasonable sense before something is in chaos and the emotions are out of control. Again, I've talked about this many times. A lot of times if I'm sitting with a married couple that's going through struggles, very seldom do I know more than they do. I mean, I'm trained in some areas, great, I get that, but the biggest advantage that I usually bring to it is I just don't feel as emotional as you do about what you're going through. And so I can help kind of work through or facilitate some of those things of what's true and what's not when the emotion lies to us at times. Again, as she talked about, and I think she did a great job at this, medication, don't give up on medication. Again, sometimes it'll shift on you, and as he said, it's only 50% of the game, but it is 50% of the game. And this is probably the one disorder that when I'm walking with people that are going through it, that there is just a much higher tendency of just saying, I'm feeling better now, I want to get off these drugs. And they take themselves off the drugs, and then it goes back into a spiral again. Or I just want to be like everybody else. We all do. And like I said, with my diabetes, I wish I didn't have to take 2 pills a day, but that's just part of my condition. That's just part of the road. Don't let a misdiagnosis discourage you, because I looked at some of the stats. I thought there was some in the videos as well, and I apologize, I don't have them in front of me. But I think on the average, to get diagnosed bipolar, the average person usually takes 10 years to figure out what's going on. And that's with working with counselors. So don't give up because there's a misdiagnosis. This thing takes and masks itself as other things, and it's easy to go through the struggles. Having that support team around you, having safeguards in place both for the manic and for the depression. Understanding that for those that are in your life, it is a little hard on them, and that's okay. Did you hear that? It is a little hard on them. There needs to bring some of that to the table, but it's okay because they're still there. And they love you, and they're saying, I want to walk with you on this. Well, we talked about the Good Samaritan. It wasn't an easy day for him, but it was a good day because he showed compassion, and he went on that walk. So just taking and saying, understanding that, and then again, we're back to lean into the truth of God and the truth that people love you and don't listen to some of the things that bipolar is trying to tell you. From the other side of things, again, I know it's a little bit shorter, but I think we'll kind of get in a pretty good rhythm of some things. For those embracing compassion, if you have someone in your life that's bipolar, the first thing I say is, again, don't freak out, just educate yourself. Okay, if you write nothing else down, please get that one. Educate yourself. We went through, and it was a little bit more complex than just bipolar, as most things are. With any mental health issue, there's usually multiple indicators or multiple struggles going on that are working in partnership. But we went through a very tough situation where bipolar was part of it with someone several years back. And I remember that it was impacting the church, and the elders were involved in the conversations. And there was a lot of confusion. It was very hard to navigate because for most of the elders, they just have never met anybody, at least that they knew, that had bipolar. They had never educated themselves on bipolar. And so it's very hard to get out of it. Why are they acting like this? Or why can't it just be this? Or getting confused about the details and struggles. And I remember at that time, we ended up having a meeting with the elders, with a counselor friend of mine that works at the Mary Counseling Center here in town, who also happens to have a husband who is bipolar, with Monica, who was part of that as well. She was dating a gentleman at the time who was also bipolar. And all of us sat in our living room and we talked and we talked and we talked. And it's not like we walked out of there in 5 minutes going, oh, okay, I get it. It's hard. It's big. And so being part of that and getting yourself educated does make a difference. Talk to somebody else who's walked the road with someone that they loved with it as well. We would definitely be happy to partner with any of you on that. Make sure that you're a really good listener, especially when things are off base. Be a champion for them. Sometimes it can get to a point where they're not acting in a positive way, and you might have to put some healthy boundaries in place to protect yourself, and we fully get that. But if they're trying to work through it, understand for them, the rest of the world is against them. And so seeing you not give up when they're trying is imperative. And again, I just want to stay with that because someone in this case, it might contribute to a very abusive situation that you should not be in or that you need to protect yourself from. But for those who are working with this and working with you, they need people that listen and that care. Be active in the treatment. That doesn't mean you have to go to the counseling session, but don't be afraid to ask, how's it going? How's the last counseling session? Making it normal, because for them, and we all have struggles, right? And so let's make struggles normal and be able to talk about them and support them. Supporting and not pushing them, understanding the mood shifts. Again, with my friend who wrote here, I'm very unsurprised when I get a text or a conversation that seems out of the left field, that they were fine yesterday and today everything's falling apart. That's part of the game. That's part of their path. And so that doesn't surprise. So being patient, staying optimistic in those moments, embracing truth, holding that line, showing them that line matters. With my friend, a lot of times, if she says something, and she in that moment is definitely the depression end of things, and you say, it's really, and after all these years, it comes down to, you know what I'm going to say, and I know that you're going to tell me I'm wrong. I know, but okay. So let me say this, and then she'll tear it apart. Let me say this, and she'll tear it apart. Say, okay, I love you, I'm praying for you. If you want to hook up at Arby's right now, I'm all in. But you're going to keep tearing apart everything I'm saying right now, and I don't know how to help you right now. And she'll be like, okay, yeah, I know. That's just part of it. That's just kind of our routine that we've worked to, of just being able to acknowledge those things without making her feel bad about it, or that there's something weird about her or anything of that nature. Know when to take a break. Know when you need to take and work on yourself to be able to go back into it. Don't neglect yourself. And again, everything is about love and truth. Everything's about love and truth. If it turns into an abusive relationship, please don't mishear me on anything I'm saying. If you need to get help, you need to get out. You need to protect yourself. You need to protect your children. We have resources to help you with that, and we've helped people in those situations. Don't put yourself in an abusive situation. What we're talking about is how to help somebody who is struggling, that is open to your help, and that you're working with. So with that, again, I think it's a little bit more of a condensed standpoint, and I do want to save some things that we're going to be talking about tonight, which I'll explain here in a second. But I do want to throw out this one last thing that I think really applies into this. But as I do, will you do me a favor and get your Bibles and go to Hebrews 10? That's why we'll give you a little bit of time. But Hebrews 10 is where we're going to go. So, and again, there's Bibles in the baskets underneath the chairs around the room, and YouVersion's up and running, so you would be taking notes or following along. But as you go to Hebrews 10, let me take and tackle one thing that can really be tackled on any week of any of these topics that we're talking about, that I do get asked about a lot, but I do think comes up here as well. Is there any correlation between mental illness and spiritual oppression? It's something I get asked a lot about when we're talking about mental health. Because again, some of these things, they're just so hard. I walked into a situation, just thinking I was hanging out with a couple of buddies, and the husband was going berserk because he had gone through a major medical condition a couple months before, miraculously survived it, and his wife, who had multiple struggles, was sharing just how disappointed she was that he got through it, and she really wished he had died. It really can express in different ways. It can express in violent ways. It can express in very manipulative ways. And so when people are going through some of these extreme ones, especially, and then they look at these times when Jesus is dealing with people in the scripture and he's casting out demons, some of the things that we see within those demonic possessions have similar characteristics to some of the things that we just talked about here, especially in one that's a little bit more expressive. And so I know that I usually hear someone say, well, that was actually mental illness, and back then they didn't understand what mental illness was, and so they didn't have the terminology, so they just say it was demonic, and then Jesus healed them. And I want to say something to the pro and to the con on that. I think it's extremely dangerous thinking. I don't think Jesus knew less about mental health than we do today. I don't think when Jesus calls out demons by name, it's because he's mistaken. There is spiritual oppression that will play out with some similarities to what we have here. But I think it's just as equally dangerous to look at mental health and saying, well, that's just demons, that's just spiritual. That's misdiagnosis that also leads to, we're corrupted. We're corrupted because of sin, and so we have physical issues, relational issues, emotional issues, mental health issues. There's a very much a part that this is how sin has impacted us. There is spiritual oppression. There are times that the two go hand in hand together, but that does not mean that someone has a mental health issue that they got a demon living inside of them. But I also want to rewrite the Bible on this stuff. And I think that's important to know, because misdiagnosis happens within mental health, but also happens within the church, and we handle things in ways that can come off abusive with good intentions. There's a situation within the scripture back in 1 Kings and 2 Kings, the entire thing with Elijah the prophet and the king Ahab and his wife Jezebel, where Jezebel was pretty jacked up. And there's a lot of things that we see within her story that resembles bipolar, and then we see things that by a casual glance might almost be bipolar extreme, but that's because there was spiritual oppression dealt within it as well. And it was so challenging that Elijah, who just went up against the king, just went up against 450 prophets of Baal in front of everybody, who had no problem with conflict. As soon as he found out that Jezebel was involved and she said she's going to kill him, ran away into the desert until he had no strength left, fell down and said, God, just kill me. I don't want to have to deal with this, everything else. And it's like, what the heck? And it's because the Jezebel spirit is so damaging and so overwhelming. We have dealt with it 3 times in our 16 years, and it's really painful. So I fully get where he's coming from. I won't even make a man joke, woman joke there, or anything of that nature. It's just really damaging, and needs to be handled different than just the one thing or the other thing. So I would be a little cautious of, again, over spiritualizing mental health issues, but also discounting real spiritual health issues. So there's a lot within this, and it's tough to go through. But the thing that's interesting with Jezebel's story is she went on and on and on and on, and the thing that made the difference was the people that were closest to her. And unfortunately, it's not a happy ending. She was someone who was unrepentant and murderous and would not stop. And so finally, it was a different prophet, not Elijah, who called up to those who surrounded her and said, she needs thrown down. This needs to be done. The truth is this is to a point of no return for her. And so they threw her down, and she had a very violent death, very gruesome. If you want the Bible after dark issue, you might want to read that story. It's not one you read to the kids before they go to sleep. But in the same way, when it comes to bipolar, whether or not somebody's leaning into it or leaning away from it, the people around them are really key. Very, very key. A lot of times we try to be well-meaning and we feed the challenge. Or or we try to make the challenge lighter than what it is. I have seen a lot of beautiful testimonies come out of friends having tough conversations and saying, we're worried about you, we encourage you, we're here for you. And some people lean into it and some do not. And that's what kind of brought me to this Hebrews 10 standpoint and why it's so important for us as a church to work together. If I start reading in verse 19, it says this, it says, therefore, brothers, therefore, sisters, since we have confidence to enter the holy places by the blood of Jesus, by the new and living way that he opened for us through the curtain, that is, through his flesh. And since we have a great priest over the house of God, let us draw near with a true heart and full assurance of faith, with our hearts sprinkled clean from an evil conscience and our bodies washed with pure water. Let us hold fast the confession of our hope without wavering, for he who promised is faithful. And let us consider how to stir each other up to love, to good works, not neglecting to meet together as some are in the habit of doing, but encouraging one another, and all the more as we see the day coming near. Now, when I read this, there's a lot of really awesome truths in this. As we go through this, we see that we have boldness to enter into the King. I was just, during the first worship song, I thought I'd go over and check out TSF Kids. Again, I'm their pastor too, and I want to be able to see them. I want them to see me. And our kids are over there talking about an Old Testament scripture about the king and the queen, and they were asking if the queen was scared of the king, and they were talking about these different things about having that confidence to be able to go in and see him. I thought, man, that's just perfect with what we're talking about today, because, again, if we look at it from an Old Testament standpoint, you weren't allowed to go to see the king unless if he requested you. And if you went in without that request, he either raised his staff and said it's okay for you to come in, or it was an automatic death sentence. So going and talking to your husband when he's the king and he didn't call for you can be a little intimidating. What we have is that comparison to our king, who says, my staff's always up. Just come boldly. Just come boldly. The truth that we have that in our lives and spiritually, that we are changed. And it talks about us being complete. It talks about drawing near with a true heart, and that our God who has promised, he has promised, is faithful. But then it talks to us about the importance of being together in the same paragraph in the same topic. Of not giving up being together, not walking out, not taking and saying this is too hard or whatever the case may be, but how important it is that we stay together. Another thing I talk about when it comes to married couples, well, actually couples are getting ready to get married as part of our premarital counseling, or I guess when they're going through struggles, because sometimes we have a husband and wife that just can't understand why they keep butting heads and why things are just always so hard. And almost always it's because we have different goals in the marriage. I know for the most part, a lot of people I work with identify as being Christian or were raised in the church, but that doesn't mean that God is their goal. That's something we really have to consciously choose, that God is the main goal. And when you have one spouse having God as the goal, and the other spouse saying, oh yeah, I like going to church with you and everything, but I'm really worried about my 401k, is their driving goal and how that they make their decisions, we grow apart from each other. It's natural. It's just a setup. Or my goal is the kids. The number one thing in my life is the kids. The number one thing in my life is travel, whatever the case may be. But when my goal is God, and Jenny's goal was God, then as we grow closer to him, we grow closer together. Does that make sense? Doesn't mean it's always perfect, but we got common goals. So whenever we come up against those bumps, that's where things are coming into. This is what the author of Hebrews is saying as well. If we come boldly together, if we put that focus into him, if we count on him fulfilling the things that he actually promised to us, and that's what's driving us together, we don't give up and take and go off over to here, then we're moving to someplace together. And that's